Hello and welcome back to Mudwalkers. My name is Chris. Check out the Patreon link in the description and do hit that subscribe button and the little bell. That helps a lot. Subscribe button helps me a lot and most of you are not subscribed. All right, let's get into it. I first saw this article years ago and I still think that it is the single most formidable article I've ever seen arguing against Christian nudism. So to my non-nudist brethren out there, if you're looking for ammunition against your nudist friends, this article is the one. For my nudist brethren out there, this video will tell you why the article still isn't convincing against nudism. Because, like I said, the article is the most powerful against Christian nudism that I've ever seen. But I still think it falls short of being compelling. I've included the entire article in the video, I think. But if I've missed anything, do let me know. Plus, I've added the link to the original article in the description below in case you want to read it for yourself. Actually, I would say, please do read it for yourself. It's from a website called Tectonics. But the author appears to identify himself as JPH. So if you're watching this video on Vimeo, you'll see me point up here a lot, but you won't see anything on Vimeo. Instead, when I point up here, there will be a link to that in the description below, not up here. On YouTube, you will see the video cards right there, but you won't see them on Vimeo. So look in the description. Let's deal with the article point by point. The Liberated Christians website offers an article titled, "Nudity is Natural and Wholesome," though we do assume that the webmasters do not think it's so natural and wholesome that they walk around in the altogether themselves. We will use it as a template to answer the broader question of whether, biblically speaking, the titular assertion is correct. So, right out of the gate, JPH is explicit that the purpose of his article is to prove biblically that nudism is wrong. Biblically. That'll be important as we proceed. The article begins by telling us that the sense of shame we get from nudity is not inborn, it is learned. Babies have no shame, and neither did many early Christians in biblical times. We'll address that latter assertion in a moment, but for the former, it's worth pointing out that babies have no shame or remorse when it comes to sweating their drawers either. Whether liberated Christians will follow that example as well remains to be seen. After this, we are vaguely assured, at any rate, that nudism promotes a healthy respect and trust with each other. I imagine the inmates at my former venue of work would find that news welcome and insist that they were perusing pornography out of healthy respect for the subjects therein and for a greater experiential appreciation for the beauty and dignity of the body. Somehow I doubt if the prison disciplinary committee would buy that one. So the first thing JPH does in the article is start making fun of the Christian naturists. JPH, this kind of stuff doesn't make us want to believe you. It makes us focus. It makes us want to close the tab and just never go to the website again. If you want us to listen, you'll catch more flies with honey. So even just from an effectiveness standpoint, you could do better. Tectonics is also responding to an original article by the Liberated Christians. The link to that will also be in the description below. And Liberated Christians wrote their article in a super cordial way. They were super polite, super nice about what they wrote. I don't agree with everything in their article, but they were very nice about it. And Tectonics repays them with this. I don't know. Interestingly enough, though, JPH doesn't address the point that they made about the American response to nudity being a learned behavior. Is that a tacit concession? I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. We then get to the section on liberated Christians. Thinks this is the biblical view of the subject. The matter of Adam and Eve covering themselves is waved off as a matter of God just going along with the idea of the attempts to hide from sin. From there, we are treated to a few biblical sites, but many more are left out, along with some pertinent social data, so let's expose, that to begin. Yeah, that pro-nudism argument is actually really weak. Our main source here is Pilch and Molina's Handbook of Biblical Social Values. Liberated Christians seems to have an idea elsewhere that the sex is dirty approach was borrowed from the Greeks, but they'd be dead wrong. Nudity in the biblical era, as Pilch and Molina note, was associated with sin and shame. And the Genesis connection is the start of this. Why? Some would say that it's because the first couple were originally covered by a glory that was lost at the fall. And this may be supported by that Paul speaks in 2 Corinthians 5 of not being found naked once we receive our heavenly tent. But whatever the reason, nudity thereafter was considered shameful. And Pilch and Molina reckon with two factors in this respect: honor and shame, and purity and pollution. If it's true that all nakedness in ancient Israel, outside of the marriage bed, was treated with this level of shame, then, I mean, that's interesting, but not really enough for a moral rule for modern Christians. I mean, they also thought that it was deeply shameful for men to be beardless, but that isn't a rule. Oh yeah, and all these things. So we need more than just shame to get a rule out of the Bible. The cultural sensibilities of ancient people groups just aren't compelling as moral imperatives. Not for us, not for Christians. The Bible is our standard. Ancient cultures, yes, including Israel, because our standard is the Bible. Remember, JPH said he would show biblically why nudism is wrong. Not culturally, biblically. Let's proceed. Let's start with 2 verses liberated Christians seems not to notice. Exodus 20:26 and Exodus 28:42. If public nudity was wholesome and natural, then one is constrained to ask why God is telling the priests to make sure that they get covered and stay covered. Party naked is not part of the Deuteronomic Code, but to the connection now with shame, and where Pilch and Molina write, cultural attitudes toward women in ancient Judaism directed that they be defensive of their chastity. Such concern for female virtue was also realized in the expectation that women's bodies be clothed as fully as possible, with the result that loss of clothing was synonymous with loss of virtue. Public nudity inevitably meant shame for them, for their chastity was compromised. Their physical body was no longer exclusively the property of their husbands. Again, the culture stuff is irrelevant. JPH turns to the priestly garments, the priestly uniform, as an argument against nudism. That's interesting. The rules weren't for all mankind, they were for Israelites. They weren't for all Israelites, they were for Levites. They weren't for all Levites, they were for priests. They weren't for priests, they were just for priests while they were on duty. So this rule doesn't even apply to what priests wore when they were at home, or even when they were walking around town outside of the tabernacle. This is to say nothing of any other Israelite or any other human being, to which the rule would have been completely irrelevant. Now JPH asks a solid question, a great question. If it was okay to be naked, why wouldn't God let priests be naked on his altar? That's a solid question, bro. I appreciate that. That's a good question. The fact is the Torah never answers this question, though. My personal favorite interpretation that I've seen from scholars is that it was a preventative measure against sexual intercourse while the priests were on duty. Yes, it's gross, unbelievably disgusting, but it was very common practice among pagan priests at the time. Hi, Samantha, yes. I'd love to pass your prayers on to the gods. But now hear me out. I know this sounds strange, but your prayers need energy. Energy? Yes, energy. We need to energize your prayers with something powerful to ensure that they have enough strength and volume to reach the gods. Okay, what do I do? What, really? Oh, I know. I thought it sounded dumb too, but it's right here in the prayer manual. Let me see it. No, I mean, it is sacred and meant only to be read by the priests of the gods. Do you want your prayers heard or not? I guess so. Then we will do what must be done. I mean, yes. Okay, fine. So yeah, gross, but it's how the world worked at the time, at least in pagan circles. So if you had boxers that went from here to here, ain't nothing happening. So as long as the priests were in uniform, it was impossible to energize prayers. That being said, wardrobe malfunctions are super hilarious and distracting, which could be a big part of it. Yahweh wants focused, serious worshipers, not tittering gossips giggling about a scrotum. Now let's look at some verses that seem to have escaped JPH's notice. In Exodus 29, Yahweh commands Moses to ritually wash Aaron and his sons to prepare them to be priests. This was a preamble to putting the priestly uniforms on Aaron and his sons for the first time. The uniforms included the special underwear, I might remind you. So it sounds like Aaron and his sons were completely naked in front of the congregation for a little bit there. You can find Moses' fulfillment of that command in Leviticus chapter 8. There's also Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. She was bathing in full view of the public, and then when Yahweh went to David to condemn him for committing, adultery with Bathsheba, Yahweh doesn't ascribe any guilt whatsoever to Bathsheba. In fact, he describes her as an innocent lamb. So if he wanted to condemn her, it was the perfect chance, and he didn't do it. Quite the opposite. He presented her as a passive victim of David's rage and lust. Actually, I did an entire video about this right here. Or on Vimeo, it's in the description. You just look right, it's down there, you see it? So she's not exactly presented in a seductive motif. You'd think if it was wrong, he would have said, you know, something at least. Isn't it interesting though, that in this day and age of, digital searchable Bibles, that these are the very strongest passages that JPH could find? If these are the strongest ones, then I think we're still in pretty good shape. Food for thought. Liberated Christians actually shows some awareness of this last point in other essays, but make no mention here and abuses it as well. But that will be returned to later. Let's remark at once, lest someone think the Bible a Ferengi charter, that men too are subject to this, as Pilgrim Melina note. Even in regard to men, we find a comparable pattern. Just as the woman's sexual organs are occasionally called her shame, so also the penis is Adam's shame, in phrases such as, he covered his shame, to cover his shame. Again, the cultural stuff just is not relevant. Do we also have to grow beards and, provide dowries for our daughters' marriages, arrange our daughters' marriages? Are we allowed to take slaves from our war captives? The list goes on. There are lots of things that the Israelites had cultural attitudes about that we would differ with them on. The question is not ancient cultures. The question is, what does Scripture say about it? I don't condemn murder because some rabbi wrote about it in the Mishnah. I condemn murder because the Bible says don't murder. Now, a word from today's sponsor. This episode of Mudwalkers has been brought to you by my generous supporters over on Patreon. Shout out to Nature Him, Todd, Alex M, Edward, John S, Joseph, Charlie, Lionheart, Adam, Edward T, Jay Good, Cyan, John W, Clifton M, None Here, Marty, Austin S, Martin C, Benjamin M, this person, JLDL, David H, Chris, Lamont W, Gary, Corky S, Michael M, Kens L, John F, Jeremy H, G10, Richard M, PJH, and Tom L. That's getting to be a mouthful, you guys. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. You guys are making my channel possible. You're keeping my work sustainable. I can't thank you enough for everything that you're doing. Guys, I'm so excited about the future of Mudwalkers right now. You guys are amazing. We have a $5 option and a $10 option for subscribing to me on Patreon. Both options get early access to all my content, as much of it as I'm, able to upload early, which is almost every single video. But the $10 option also gets access to a monthly Zoom hangout, monthly video call. We don't use Zoom anymore. Monthly Zoom. It's a monthly video call. It's amazing. We get to swap stories and share ideas and stuff. Lost my mojo, man. Back to the video. The LC folks also seem to miss 1 Corinthians 12:23, in which Paul wrote of the shameful parts of the body. Paul doesn't tell us what body parts he's talking about here. Some scholars actually think he's talking about our internal organs like the liver or the spleen. And besides, modern translations don't always use the word shame here. The ESV and NIV both translate these phrases as less honorable and uncomely. So there's no grammatical reason to say definitively that Paul is talking about genitals and nipples and anuses and buttocks. And even if he was, he's not giving us a rule here. Needless to say, they are also unaware of a few other social points, such as stripping prisoners of war was a way of shaming them. The LC folks note that Christ was naked on the cross. Possibly, the Romans may have allowed a brief loincloth so as not to offend Jewish sensibilities, but are practically blasphemous in citing this as a positive in a case for public nudity. Rather, the stripping of the prisoner was considered a shameful thing, causing great loss of public honor. Lest it be objected that these were cases of persons being stripped against their will, and therein is what lies the shame, consider both the case of the priests above in Exodus and the story told by Josephus of a Roman soldier who exposed his rear end to the temple crowd and so shamed the Jews that he provoked a riot. At Qumran, similarly, a censure was placed on any man who inadvertently allowed his sexual organs to protrude from beneath a garment. A rabbinic comment, after the time of Jesus, states one must not stand nude in the presence of the divine name. Jews entering a public toilet were told not to stand facing east or west, for it was the axis of the Holy of Holies. In the time of Antiochus, pious Jews fought against the attempt to Hellenize the people by introducing the gymnasium where young men exercised nude. The war doctrines of ancient pagans and the reactions of their victims to those war doctrines is not relevant to this discussion. I could say the same thing about Roman soldiers and crucifixions. The fact that people did things a certain way, and then other cultures reacted to that a certain way. That's all cultural data. None of that is relevant to the discussion of whether or not the Bible condemns something. We will use it as a template to answer the broader question of whether, biblically speaking, clothing is a matter of establishing purity boundaries, which are in turn a microcosm of the social system, just like other laws. Clothing begets clarity, and clarity denotes purity. But when people are naked, all such defining marks vanish, and one's identity, role, and status become ambiguous. Nudity erases social clues, and so is unclean. What liberated Christians think is Puritanism is actually purity. He doesn't quote any scripture here to establish the claim that clothing is about establishing purity boundaries, so I'm not sure what he's basing that on. My guess is probably the cultural stuff, but I'm not sure. Since the article purports to be a biblical case against Christian nudism, this claim is meaningless without biblical support. With that said, what of liberated Christians' attempt to justify nudity from the Bible, other than what we have already mentioned? It's as bad as you may expect. Jesus himself was undressed at some point, according to John 13. Jesus rose from the table and laid aside his garments briefly. How that briefly constitutes any help for nudity being wholesome and natural is one of those mysteries we'll have to wonder about. But if it is so, then we have to ask why the condition wasn't made permanent. Indeed, by this logic, Christianity should have been a nudist movement from day one, since part of the theology was that the shame of sin was removed, and the sinless Jesus should have got naked and stayed naked. But clearly, he didn't. So even if this is an altogether nudism, the word garments refers to an outer cloak, not to all clothes, same in Mark 10:50, it only serves to show that this is not normal. Yeah, I mean, even though I'm a nudist, I would say that the arguments they gave here are really not very good. JPH argues that if nudism is actually so, healthy and good, then Christianity should have been a nudist movement from the very beginning. Well, I mean, organic food is healthier, but Jesus didn't mandate organic food. Some political systems are better than others, but Jesus didn't comment on that either. The list goes on, of course. I would agree with JPH that the washing of the disciples' feet isn't relevant, and it's not a very good support. So I think that liberated Christians would have been better off not citing that one. That being said, early Christianity was a nudist movement, at least by modern standards. I mean, all the baptisms were done naked for centuries after, during his ministry and centuries after. But I would also say that maybe Jesus didn't talk about this a lot because he didn't have to. People were already naked a lot in the ancient world. Christ was not only naked on the cross, but he also left the linen cloths lying there, John 25, in the tomb when he rose. Did he tell Thomas to wait a moment while he took off his robe, and then to put out your hand and place it in my side? We have addressed the matter of being on the cross above. As for the other, the linen cloths were burial linens, not clothes. They would not be worn anyway. They were not clothes, and would also be ritually unclean. There was no mistaking the idea that when the word of the Lord came through Ezekiel in reference to Israel, I made you grow like a plant of the field, naked and bare. You grew up and became tall and arrived at full maidenhood. Your breasts were formed and your pubic hair had grown. And as noted, passages like this only emphasize the shamefulness of nudity. This is part of an oracle of judgment on Israel. If it is really wrong to be seen nude, why would Jesus be around the naked fishermen who stripped for work? At best, this might argue for nudity while at work, fishing, on a boat in the middle of the sea. However, if it is really right to be seen nude, then why did Peter slap a coat on before he went to see Jesus? Yeah, Jesus on the cross is not a very good example to cite here. I agree. And I'm also not convinced that Jesus was definitely naked in the garden following his resurrection. Yes, he left the grave clothes behind, but we're not told what he was wearing, so trying to be definite about it, like he was definitely wearing this or he was definitely not wearing something, it goes beyond the text. So him being naked is possible, but uncertain and definitely unimportant. I would nuance the Ezekiel passage by pointing out that culturally, the nakedness of this girl is probably intended to show that she's more helpless than anything else. If you were poor, you couldn't afford clothes. If you were a woman with no family connections, like the girl in the parable definitely was, then you were poor. People simply just couldn't afford it. That's why there were so many naked people in the ancient world. They couldn't afford it. Which is why the Bible calls upon people who are relatively well off to provide for the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. These are not metaphors. There were people out there who hadn't eaten for days. You should feed them. People who sold their clothes so they could eat dinner that night. clothe the naked. Both of these mean the same thing: provide for the poor in ways that they can't provide for themselves. Now we get to Peter swimming to shore. This is a fun one. I actually did a whole video about this one already, up here. So I'll summarize my view on the relevance of this passage by saying that a story about what one guy did on one particular occasion isn't relevant. It's relevant for something. I'm saying it's not relevant to this conversation. A story is not a rule. I mean, if we're talking about what people wore on given occasions, John the Baptist wore camel hair clothes for his entire ministry. So it's a story. Does that mean that we all have to wear camel hair clothes? Sounds pretty uncomfortable. Of course we don't have to wear that, because what one guy wore on a particular occasion doesn't constitute a rule for all mankind. LC now goes outside the Bible. Did those who were baptized by John have to be dressed? It was the early church's custom to baptize men, women, and children together nude. The reason why is even quoted. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem preached to nude candidates, "You are now stripped and naked," in this also imitating Christ on the cross. Once again, this is a matter of public shame. I was actually kind of surprised by this reference to Cyril, because JPH seems to interpret Cyril the opposite way of what Cyril actually said. But before I read Cyril to you, let's talk about this for a quick sec. If getting baptized naked was indeed so awful and degrading, it reflects very poorly on early Christians' character, that this is what they put their converts through. Because historically, naked baptism wasn't the exception. It was the rule. I mean, there were literally rules about this. And naked baptism wasn't controversial in the early church. It was the norm. It's just how things were done. I also have a video about that here. Why would you push your brand new converts away from your upstart religion by embarrassing and degrading them on the first day? On the contrary, Christianity quickly became very enticing to ancient Romans, and they flocked to Christianity. Now let's look at what Cyril actually said.
As soon then as you entered, you put off your tunic, and this was an image of putting off the old man with his deeds. Having stripped yourselves, you were naked, in this also imitating Christ, who was stripped naked on the cross, and by his nakedness put off from himself the principalities and powers, and openly triumphed over them on the tree. For since the adverse powers made their lair in your members, you may no longer wear that old garment. I do not at all mean this visible one, but the old man which waxes corrupt in the lusts of deceit. May the soul which has once put him off never again put him on, but say with the spouse of Christ in the Song of Songs, I have put off my garment, how shall I put it on? O wondrous thing! You were naked in the sight of all, and were not ashamed. For truly you bore the likeness of the first-formed Adam, who was naked in the garden, and was not ashamed.
So contrary to what JPH said, Cyril's reference to Christ here is unabashedly and remarkably positive. He was using Christ's nakedness as a symbol of Christ's triumph, his victory over death and sin and everything that he triumphed over on the cross. Cyril even specifically says that the baptizants were not ashamed, which is the opposite of what JPH said. So JPH, I love you. Like I said, the article was very rigorous. Just read your sources. Cyril's writings are available for free online. Google it. Misrepresenting Cyril this way was probably an accident, but it could easily be misconstrued as deceptive, so just watch out for that. Back to the Old Testament, and with no knowledge of the Exodus sites, note that they claim the 10 Commandments say nothing about nudity. What about the rest of the Old Testament? And as if that were a serious enough issue to be made one of the top 10. Or the social world. We are told, in Old Testament times, being nude was very common and accepted. Touching the testicles of a revered superior was a man's way of testifying to the validity of his statement or vow. JPH seems to dismiss the idea of a moral mandate out of hand, but I think it's a fair question. If it really is so wrong, then wouldn't we expect to find a clear moral mandate on this, at some point? It's not super complicated. Just never let anyone ever see you naked, except your spouse in private settings, certain family exceptions like for hygiene, medical stuff, basic exceptions. It's not super complicated. Oh, and he said it's not a serious issue? Okay, so it's serious enough to make sure that you tell people in no uncertain terms to never, ever, 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 ever do it. But not serious enough for the Bible to ever mention this rule. Then he claims that the rest of the Old Testament itself is enough to show that nudism is wrong. But he hasn't even kind of demonstrated that. So without broader support from the Old Testament, this assertion here kind of rings hollow. Excuse me, but touching is not the same as exposing. To the contrary, as we show, being nude was not common, and exposure was categorically rejected. The example of Isaiah was part of an oracle of judgment illustrating Israel's shame. Saul's self-exposure was regarded as shameful, and despite the claim, not related to his prophethood. As was David's nakedness, though it is not noted that he was girt with a linen ephod. Michael complained of him being underdressed below his station. See note on boundaries above, not totally naked. Right here, I agree with JPH. You don't have to have skin-to-skin contact here for this to be true. Abraham could just as easily have still had his skirts on and just had his servant, do it through the skirt. No skin-to-skin contact necessary. And I think David dancing is also not a super helpful example because it's not explicitly clear what it was he was wearing, all of it. Given the culture, Michael could have just as easily been upset about the fact that his skirts were flying all over the place while he was dancing, or just that he was dressed as a peasant instead of a king, which would have diminished her honor standing among the people, given that his status was her status because she was his wife and queen. But I actually really like, now I can't remember which one I heard it from, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, or from Marty Solomon, but someone made a really great point about the linguistics of him dancing. Maybe I'll have to make a whole video about that, and I'll bring that up, that specific source. That'll be great. And despite JPH's protests, Saul's nakedness is not regarded as shameful in the text. On the contrary, the Israeli people actually point to this as evidence that Saul is probably a prophet now, which seems like it's the opposite of a shameful conclusion. Thus, it is patently false for liberated Christians to connect the dislike for nudity in the church with an anti-body philosophy derived from Plato. This was derived from Judaism, and it was not anti-body, but anti-purity. What they call the puritanical perversion that our body is shameful and should be covered up at all times is found in the Bible and in pre-New Testament Judaism. I don't know much about Plato, so I'll just claim ignorance here. But me personally, I would appeal to the Gnostics, because they had some pretty messed up views of the body as being necessarily evil because they were physical, etc., etc. So that's what I would point to as Gnostic thought eventually making its way into Christianity, especially through figures like Aurelius Augustinus and men like that. And now we've had to deal with these Gnostic ideas in Christianity for, over 1,000 years. But JPH's assertion here that certain body parts have to be covered at virtually all times has just not been supported by the rest of his arguments up to this point. He hasn't even produced one Bible verse to that effect. We don't have to prove that the Bible requires nudity. We don't have to have anyone in the Bible practicing naturism. All we have to show is that the Bible doesn't condemn it, which makes this a Romans 14 issue. Video here. Follow me on Vimeo. I have social media usernames and whatnot in the description below. Check those out, and yeah, bye. The subscribe button, the subscribe button helps me. It's the will of the gods, bro. So if you had boxers going from Is that a rabbit? Yahweh wants focused. You can find Moses' fulfillment of that command in Leviticus chapter 8. Ooh. That being said, there was a surprising amount of So contrary to what JBH said, So contrary to what JPH said, we don't have to have anyone